want to rank the 2020 NFL head coaching hires from worst to best. Now, there were 5 head coaches last offseason who were hired. Now, 3 of them were hired in the NFC East alone. You had Mike McCarthy, who got hired by the Dallas Cowboys. You had Joe Judge, who was hired by the New York Giants. And you had Ron Rivera, who was hired by Washington. Then you had Kevin Stefanski, who got hired by Cleveland, and Matt Rule. So I'm going to be ranking these guys from worst to best. So let me start off with number 5, Mike McCarthy. The Dallas Cowboys finished 6-10 last year, and it was a really disappointing year. The defense was one of the worst defenses in NFL history. They couldn't stop the run. They couldn't stop the pass. They pretty much couldn't do anything. And their only bright spot was rookie cornerback at the time going into the second season now, Trayvon Diggs. That was their only bright spot on defense. Their linebacker position was a huge disappointment. Leighton Vander Esch, we don't know if he can even stay healthy. You got Jalen Smith, who had a down year. You also got DeMarcus Lawrence, one of the highest pass rushers in the NFL, who basically didn't do anything. So it was just an all-around disappointing year for Dallas. Now, Dak Prescott got injured on offense, which is why I cut Mike McCarthy some slack. But even then, Mike McCarthy is supposed to be an offensive-minded coach. Every good coach is able to win with their backup quarterback. If you can't win with your backup quarterback, then you're not that great of a head coach. So I look at Mike McCarthy. I think he was the worst hire from 2020 last offseason. Now, I definitely believe that he probably could get this thing turned around. You got Dak Prescott coming back. You have a team that should be a lot better defensively this season than what it was last year. So hopefully he can get it turned around this year. And he's definitely on the hot seat. I don't care if he needs more time. Like, he's definitely on the hot seat. Like, with all the talent that Dallas has, the Dallas Cowboys should make it to the playoffs this year with no problems. Now, at number 4, I have Matt Rule. Now, Matt Rule started out with a lot of scrutiny. There were a lot of people who didn't really like the hire. A lot of people felt he was overrated in terms of what he did with that Baylor program, which I strongly disagree with a lot of people. When you look at Baylor was a job that nobody wanted at all. When you look at all of the allegations and scandals that went around that program was pretty much dead. And Matt Rule came and resurrected that thing from the dirt and brought it back to relevancy. And we saw what happened once Matt Rule left and how bad Baylor was this past year. So you look at Matt Rule, this was a guy who had a lot of scrutiny going in. There were a lot of people who didn't really believe him. Then you see what he does in Carolina. Carolina was in a bunch of one-possession games last year. And in a handful of those games, if you had a slightly better quarterback, that probably would be the difference between you finishing 5-11 and maybe finishing 8-8 or 9-7 and backdooring your way into the playoffs with that last playoff spot. So for Matt Rule, he did a really good job with the Carolina Panthers last year because he got the most out of the young players on his roster. Guys like Brian Burns, Jeremy Chin. Like, the Carolina Panthers were way more competitive last year than what their roster may indicate. Their roster wasn't all that great last year, but they were still way better than what their record may indicate. Like, you look at the Panthers last year, you say, JT, they finished 5-11. They weren't all that good. But if you actually watched all of the Carolina Panthers games last year, a bunch of those games were decided by 7 points or less. So I look at Carolina, I think Matt Rule deserves to be the 4th best coach on this list, and he's the 4th best hire from 2020. Now we get to the top 3. Now, this was really hard to decide. Now, at number 3, I have Joe Judge. Joe Judge exceeded a lot of people's expectation in terms of what he was able to do with that New York Giants roster last year, because that was a New York Giants team that a lot of people expected to have the worst record in the NFL. Many people felt they were going to go 4-12 or 3-13. Now, the biggest surprise was how good that defense was, because that defense under Patrick Graham was phenomenal, and that defense definitely is probably going to be a top 10 unit this upcoming season. Now, offensively, you didn't really have that much. Daniel Jones was in and out due to injuries. Your star player and Saquon Barkley got his season cut short, and you didn't really have a lot of talent at receiver, and your offensive line was one of the worst, if not the worst offensive line in all of the NFL last year. So for Joe Judge, he squeezed as much juice as he could out of that New York Giants roster, and many people may not remember this, but the New York Giants were actually competing for a spot in the playoffs all the way down to week 17. They had a chance to win the NFC East last year. So the fact that the Giants were in that playoff discussion in Joe Judge's first year, I think that Joe Judge deserves a lot of recognition for that. He did a phenomenal job with the New York Giants last year. When you think about how bad that roster looked like on paper going in and what people were expecting out of New York. Like, the Giants didn't have high expectations. People expected this team to be the worst team in the NFL last year, and they ended up being really good, especially when they were able to pull off the upset of the year against the Seattle Seahawks. So Joe Judge is the third best coaching hire from 2020. Number 2 and number 1 are probably going to cause a lot of debate, but at number 2, I have Kevin Stefanski. Now, Kevin Stefanski had the best record last year out of all the coaching hires. He went 11-5. Now, Cleveland wasn't really that tough of a job. Okay, like any above average coach, any good coach could have done what Kevin Stefanski did with Cleveland. Not taking anything away, but if you had an above average coach, he probably could have did the same thing. Not taking anything away from Kevin Stefanski, but Kevin Stefanski probably had the best roster out of all the head coaches who got hired last offseason. You already had the team that had the future at quarterback secure Baker Mayfield. You got Jarvis Landry, you got Odell, you got Austin Hooper. You had all these weapons. You had improved the offensive line throughout free agency and the draft, and that defense was pretty solid as well, led by one of the best defensive players in the NFL, and Myles Garrett and Denzel Ward when he was able to stay healthy. Now, Kevin Stefanski did play in a really tough division because you do play in the AFC North. You got Cincinnati, who was competitive when Joe Burrow was healthy. You got Pittsburgh, who went to the playoffs, and you got Baltimore, who also went to the playoffs. So Kevin Stefanski did a really great job with the Cleveland Browns. Like, even though he had the best roster situation out of any other head coaching hire, like, he was brought in to change the direction, change the viewpoint of that Cleveland Browns franchise, because the Cleveland Browns are always looked at as a dysfunctional organization. So he had to go into an organization that had a bunch of dysfunction, an organization that had a lot of turmoil in the front office, and he was able to stabilize that as well as managing the personalities that he had on the roster, because Cleveland has some of the biggest personalities in the NFL. You got Odell, you got Jarvis, you got Baker. Like, that's a lot of personalities that you have to manage, and that's definitely not easy to do, managing a bunch of these big egos and these big personalities as the first year head coach. So Kevin Stefanski, he was my second best coaching hire from 2020. Number 1, I have Ron Rivera. Now, Ron Rivera, like Joe Judge, didn't inhibit a great roster. A lot of people felt Washington was going to go 4-12, 3-13. There were a lot of people that felt that Washington also was going to be one of the worst teams in the NFL last year. And I told people, I said, I expect Washington to go 7-9, and don't be surprised if you see this team competing for a playoff spot, because Ron Rivera took over a team that may not have had a lot of talent offensively, or may not have had a lot of talent as a whole. But you know one thing that Washington did have? They had one of the best defensive lines in the NFL. You got Chase Young. You got the Alabama Twin Towers down there with Jonathan Allen and Payne. You got Montez Sweat. Like, you had a bunch of talent on that defensive line for Washington, and that's what Ron Rivera wants. He wants a team that is really good, really tough, and really gritty up front, especially when it comes to in the trenches on that defensive line, and that's what Ron Rivera received. Now, linebacker wasn't all that great for Washington, and the overall roster that Washington had wasn't great. Now, they finished 2nd-9. 7-9, and they surprised a lot of people with how competitive they were in that wild card loss against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, the biggest reason why I felt Ron Rivera was the best coaching hire from last year was because he went into a situation that was probably the worst in all the NFL. Like, I don't think there were too many head coaches out there that could have had the job and could have had the performance that Ron Rivera had with Washington. When you look at everything that was going on, you have an owner that is one of the worst owners in the NFL. You got a bunch of dysfunctionality, a bunch of turmoil with a bunch of allegations and a bunch of, weird things going on in the front office. Like, Ron Rivera took over a franchise that was in disarray. Okay, the owner, from the management to the front office, with all these things they had going on, extracurricular activities that had nothing to do with football, and Ron Rivera took this franchise, stabilized it, and got it to the playoffs. Like, Washington was an absolute mess. You look at what Jay Gruden left that team in, like, that was an absolute mess. Then you had the whole Dwayne Haskins fiasco when he had time to, mess with strippers, but he ain't have time to learn the playbook. He was too worried about his Rolex and things like that. And on top of that, he also was battling cancer. So Ron Rivera had a bunch of obstacles that he had to occur. On top of that, not having a really good offense, not having an overall great roster, and yet he was still able to get Washington to the playoffs in his first year as their head coach. Like, I think Ron Rivera may have had one of the best seasons for a head coach going to a new team that we've seen in a very long time. And a lot of you guys may be like, well, JT, they finished 7-9, but forget the record. You got to really look deep into the situation that Ron Rivera took over. Like, this was a franchise that was pretty much a dumpster fire, and he saved it. Well, I wouldn't say saved it, but he brought it up from the ashes. Like, there was a bunch of turmoil, a bunch of tumultuous things that was going on with this team. You had the name change. They changed their name. Like, there was so much stuff that Ron Rivera had to, go through and endure and change. Ron Rivera basically wasn't just brought in to turn around this football team. He was brought in to turn around a team that had a culture, a really toxic and awful culture, with everything that came out last offseason about Jay Gruden and Dan Snyder. Like, Ron Rivera, for what he was able to do and all that mess, it's impressive. And I can understand if you Cleveland Browns fans feel like Kevin Stefanski should be number one, because he also took over a dysfunctional franchise as well. But Cleveland's didn't have anywhere close to how dysfunctional Washington's whole entire franchise was. Harassment, allegations, bunch of weird things going on between Dan Snyder and whatnot. Like, there was a bunch of crazy things. And Ron Rivera was able to, calm the storm, per se. So I definitely think Ron Rivera was the best head coaching hire from 2020 last offseason. So